The first thing that told me something was wrong wasn't the email. It wasn't the meeting on my calendar that morning either. It was the smell of fresh paint coming from the corner office down the hall. Nobody paints an office on a Tuesday unless somebody important is moving in by Friday. I'd been at Cedar Bluff Grain Cooperative for 16 years. Started as a scale operator weighing trucks in from the harvest, worked my way up through the dispatch desk, and for the last 11 years, I'd been the operations manager for the whole network. 38 silos spread across 4 counties in southern Iowa, contracts with about 240 family farms, and a railhead in Ottawa that moved roughly 14 million bushels a year. My name's Bennett Hollister, and if you'd asked anybody in Wayne or Appanoose County who actually ran that co-op, they'd have told you it was me. Not the board, not the general manager. Me. I knew which farmers got nervous when the moisture readings came in high. I knew that Tucker Glasgow out near Promise City would lie about his corn being non-GMO if you didn't pull a sample yourself. And I knew that the Vandermeer family had been delivering clean, organic spring wheat to bin 14 for 9 straight harvests without ever needing a recheck. I knew that bin 22 had a slow leak in the aeration fan, and you couldn't trust the temperature readings past 60 days of storage. I knew which truckers would haul straight through a thunderstorm, and which ones would park at a diner for 4 hours and lie about traffic. That kind of knowledge isn't in a binder anywhere. It lives in your head, and it takes about a decade and a half to build it up, one mistake at a time. I should have known something was off back in February when the board sold a controlling interest to a holding company out of Minneapolis. Patriot Agricultural Partners, they called themselves. Sounded like a 4th of July parade. What they actually were was a private equity outfit that had been buying up rural co-ops across the Midwest, consolidating efficiencies, which is the kind of phrase you only hear right before somebody loses their job. My buddy Cyril, who'd been the dispatch lead until he retired in 2023, called me up the night the sale went through. He'd been hearing things from his nephew who worked over at a co-op in Nebraska that Patriot Heritage had taken over the year before. "Bennett," he said, "if I were you, I'd start cleaning out my desk now. Save yourself the cardboard box." I laughed at him. I said, "Cyril, they need me. Nobody else knows where the bodies are buried in this operation." He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "That's exactly why they'll want you gone. People who know where the bodies are buried make new owners nervous." I should have listened to him. The new general manager showed up in March. His name was Sutton Whitcomb, and he was the chairman of Patriot Heritage's son-in-law, which I learned from the receptionist before I learned it from anywhere official. He was 31 years old, had an MBA from somewhere in Pennsylvania, and the first thing he did when he met me was ask if I'd ever considered digitizing the institutional knowledge base. I said, "Son, we already have a computer system. It's been digitized since 2009. He smiled at me the way people smile at their grandfather when grandfather doesn't understand what an iPhone does. For the first few weeks, Sutton mostly stayed in his office. He'd come out for the morning huddle, nod a lot, take notes on his iPad. He didn't ask many questions. That bothered me more than if he'd been peppering me with them. A man who doesn't ask questions in a new job is a man who already knows what he's going to do. In April, he started bringing visitors around, men in press slacks and women in blazers, the kind of people who look uncomfortable around grain dust. They'd walk through the elevator, ask me to explain how the routing worked between the satellite silos and the main terminal, take pictures of my whiteboard. I had this big whiteboard on the wall of my office where I tracked the rotation of stored grain, the moisture rechecks, the truck schedules, and which bins were due for fumigation. 16 years of refinements, color-coded with markers I bought myself because the company supplied ones dried out too fast. One of the visitors, a young woman with a clipboard, asked me if I'd be willing to walk through my mental model with their team. I told her I'd be happy to. I figured she was a consultant, maybe somebody they'd hired to streamline the paperwork. I sat with her for 2 hours that afternoon, explaining how I matched incoming loads to available capacity, how I balanced the FOB pricing windows against storage costs, how I knew when to push a farmer to deliver early versus letting him hold for a better basis. She took a lot of notes. She thanked me. She left. I didn't see her again for 3 weeks. When she came back, she had a laptop, and on the laptop was something called HarvestMind. It's an AI-driven decision intelligence platform, Sutton told me in a meeting he called for the whole front office, cloud native, trained on hundreds of millions of agricultural data points. The folks at Vertica Analytics in Austin have been working on this for 3 years, and Cedar Bluff is going to be their flagship deployment in the Corn Belt. I asked him a question. How many co-ops have they deployed it at so far? He didn't quite answer. He talked about pilot programs and beta partnerships in a couple of select agricultural enterprises in Texas and California. I pressed him. How many co-ops, Sutton? Real co-ops, with grain elevators, with farmers, with rail contracts? He cleared his throat. Cedar Bluff will be the first full-scale implementation. There it was. We were the test rabbit. I should have walked out of that meeting and started polishing my resume, but I'd been at Cedar Bluff for 16 years. My wife Marlene and I had raised both our girls in Centerville. My oldest, Tessa, was about to graduate from Iowa State, and our youngest, Hadley, was a junior in high school. I had a mortgage that was almost paid off and a pension I'd been counting on. I told myself this thing was going to fall on its face within 90 days and they'd come crawling back to me. I was half right. The next 2 months were the strangest of my career. The young woman with the clipboard, whose name turned out to be Adrian, came back with 3 engineers from Vertica. They set up shop in a conference room and asked me to spend 2 hours every morning transferring knowledge. I asked Sutton if I should be worried. Not at all, Bennett, he said. We see you as a strategic advisor going forward. HarvestMind is going to augment what you do, not replace it. He used that word a lot. Augment. I noticed how he held his hands when he said it, like he was holding a small invisible box. Augment. I gave them what they asked for. I walked them through the routing logic. I explained why I always held back 5% of capacity in the eastern silos during the 3rd week of harvest. I told them which farmers always delivered wet corn and needed priority drying. I gave them my whiteboard system. I told them everything. Looking back, I'm not sure why I did it so completely. Maybe I wanted to prove how much I knew. Maybe I was tired in just answering the questions in front of me. Maybe some part of me didn't believe a piece of software could actually replicate what took me 15 years to figure out, so it didn't matter what I gave them. Probably all 3. In late May, Sutton called me into his office. The whole place still smelled like paint. He had me sit in this leather chair that creaked when you moved. Real leather, not the vinyl stuff. The old general manager had a thrift store armchair with a coffee stain. Sutton's chair came from somewhere with a French name. Bennett, I want to thank you for your years of service to Cedar Bluff. I knew what was coming. The walls of the office went a little wavy, and I had to grip the armrests. As we transition to the HarvestMind platform, we're going to be restructuring the operations department. Your position is being eliminated effective the end of this week. I asked him if he was serious. He said he was. I asked him who was going to run the routing during harvest. He said HarvestMind would handle it, with oversight from a junior analyst they were bringing in from Austin, a junior analyst. 24 years old, just out of business school, who had never set foot in a grain elevator. I asked him about my pension. He said I'd be eligible for full benefits since I had over 15 years of service. That was the one decent thing he said in the home meeting, and it was only decent because it was the law. I asked him for 30 days to transition. He said he'd give me until Friday. I asked him what I was supposed to tell the farmers and the truckers and the silo crews. He told me he'd be making an announcement Monday morning, and I was welcome to attend, but I was not to discuss the change with anyone before then. I sat in that creaky leather chair and looked at him, Sutton Whitcomb, 31 years old, with a haircut that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. His MBA degree was framed on the wall behind him, the gold seal catching the light. I said, Sutton, I'm going to say this once. You're about to walk into harvest with a piece of software that's never seen a real harvest, run by a kid who's never seen a real harvest, in a region where your software has never been tested. I've got 240 farmers depending on this operation. Some of them have families that have been delivering to this elevator since the 1920s. If this thing breaks, you won't just lose money. You'll lose those families. And once you lose a family farm's trust, you don't get it back. He nodded, like he was considering my words very seriously. Then he said, we've stress-tested HarvestMind against 3 harvest cycles worth of historical data. The model performs with 94% efficiency against your baseline, 94% of paperwork, 94% of numbers in a database. I wanted to ask him if he'd ever stood on top of a silo at 4 in the morning during a moisture emergency, with a temperature alarm going off and a trucker on the radio asking if he should turn around. I wanted to ask him if he'd ever shaken Tucker Glasgow's hand after pulling a clean sample out of a load Tucker swore was conventional, but smelled like Roundup from 40 feet away. I didn't ask him any of that. I just stood up and said, "Good luck, son." I walked out of his office and out of the building, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, watching the heat waves come off the asphalt. It was the third week of May. Harvest would start the first week of October. They were giving themselves 4 months to test a brand new AI system with no humans in the loop who actually understood the operation. I drove home and told Marlene. She cried first, and then she got angry, and then she made meatloaf because that's what she does when she's trying to think. Cyril called me that night. He'd already heard. News travels fast in farm country. "Bennett, what are you going to do?" I told him I was going to wait. I was going to sit on my porch and drink coffee and watch what happened. He said, "You're not going to warn the farmers?" I told him I wasn't allowed to. I'd signed a non-disclosure as part of my severance package. Sutton's lawyer had been very clear about it. If I went around stirring up the farmers before the official announcement, they'd claw back the severance and possibly come after the pension. Cyril said, "That's cold." I said, "I know it is. But here's the thing, nobody at Patriot Heritage understood. I might have been bound by non-disclosure, but the farmers had eyes of their own. And the truckers. And the silo crews. They were going to see what was happening before anyone made any announcements." Sutton's announcement on Monday went about like you'd expect. He talked about modernization and efficiency and a new era for Cedar Bluff. He didn't mention me by name once. The room went quiet in a way that's hard to describe unless you've sat through it. A room full of people who all just realized that loyalty doesn't run both directions. By Friday of that week, I had 3 voicemails from farmers asking me if it was true. By the following Wednesday, I had 9. I returned none of them. Harvest in southern Iowa usually kicks off in the first week of October when the corn drops below 20% moisture. That summer was hot and dry, which pushed everything early. By September 22nd, the first loads were rolling in. I heard about the first problem from my neighbor, who heard about it from his cousin who drove for a hauling outfit out of Bloomfield. HarvestMind had routed a load of conventional yellow corn from a farm near Allerton into bin 14. Bin 14 was Vandermeer's bin. Vandermeer had been delivering certified organic spring wheat to that bin for 9 years. The bin had organic certification papers that had to be renewed annually and required a verified clean history. The conventional corn went on top of the organic wheat that was still in there. Nobody caught it for 2 days because the junior analyst from Austin didn't know what an organic certification audit looked like. And HarvestMind apparently didn't either. By the time someone figured it out, the Vandermeers had lost their organic certification for that bin for a minimum of 3 years. The Vandermeers' contract with the Whole Foods regional supplier was worth about $400,000 a year to them. Multi-generational family farm. 3 years out of certification means at least one of the kids isn't going to college without loans now. I heard about that one on a Tuesday. I sat on my porch and didn't say a word. Marlene asked me how I felt. I told her I felt sick, which was true. I wasn't happy about it. I'd known the Vandermeers since 2008. Hank Vandermeer used to bring me a jar of his wife's apple butter every Christmas. The next problem hit 2 weeks later. HarvestMind had been assigning truck routes based on what it called optimal corridor utilization. Sounds great until you realize it doesn't account for the fact that some of our truckers had been running specific routes for years and knew which farms had narrow access roads, which county bridges had weight restrictions that the state hadn't updated in their database, and which farmers' wives would have lunch waiting if you got there before noon. The AI had 8 trucks scheduled to pick up loads from farms along County Road J42 on a Thursday morning. 3 of those trucks were rigs that were over the bridge weight limit at the Chariton River crossing. The county had downrated that bridge in 2022 after some structural issues. The state database still listed it at its original capacity. The 3rd truck through that morning was a 53-foot loaded grain hauler. The bridge held. Barely. But it dropped about 4 inches on the south side and the county shut it down for emergency inspection. 6 farms lost access to their normal delivery route for 11 days during peak harvest. The detour added 47 miles each way. Fuel costs alone ran the farmers something like $12,000 in extra expenses, and that's before you count the lost time in the corn that started developing moisture problems while it sat in trucks waiting in line at the alternate elevator. I heard about that one from Cyril, who had stopped by the diner in Centerville where the farmers had taken to meeting every morning since harvest started. They were comparing notes. Their stories weren't matching what Sutton was telling them in his weekly emails. Things started accelerating after that. A load of soybeans went into a bin that hadn't been fumigated since the last harvest because nobody updated the maintenance schedule when they switched systems. The beans came out with weevils. 48,000 bushels of weevils. A delivery from a farm near Moravia got routed to the Otumo railhead instead of the Centerville elevator, an extra 38 miles, because HarvestMind had decided based on its pricing model that the rail loadout was more efficient. The farmer's wife was 8 months pregnant, and her husband was supposed to be home before dark. He didn't get home until past midnight. She went into labor at 3 in the morning, and they had to drive 45 minutes to the hospital with him still half asleep behind the wheel. The baby was fine. The marriage almost wasn't. Truckers started refusing assignments. Some of them just stopped picking up the phone when the kid from Austin called. The biggest disaster came on October 21st, and it had my name written all over it, even though I wasn't there. Bin 22, the one with the slow leak in the aeration fan that I've been telling maintenance about for 2 years. I've been working around it by limiting that bin to short-term storage. Anything over 60 days, the temperature readings became unreliable, and grain that you can't read temperatures on can heat and go out of condition without warning. HarvestMind had no idea about the bad fan. It was in my head, and I'd never written it down on any form, because the maintenance request was already in the system, and I figured it'd get fixed eventually. The AI loaded bin 22 with about 300,000 bushels of yellow corn in early October. Then, because of all the routing problems with other bins, it left that corn there. Past 60 days. Past 70. The temperature sensors were reading normal because the fan was barely moving air. The grain in the middle of the bins started to heat. On the morning of October 21st, a maintenance worker climbed up to do a routine inspection and opened the top hatch. The grain inside had reached internal temperatures over 160 degrees. When the fresh oxygen hit the surface, it ignited. Bin 22 burned for 3 days. They lost the entire 300,000 bushels of corn, the bin itself, and the conveyor system attached to it. The fire department from 4 counties responded. 2 firefighters got hurt, nothing life-threatening, but bad enough to make the regional news. The corn was worth roughly $1.5 million at that month's prices. The infrastructure damage was another $3 million. The insurance company sent investigators who started asking questions about maintenance logs and risk management practices and who was responsible for the operations decisions. The investigators called me on October 28th. I told them I'd been let go in May. I told them I'd been telling maintenance about the aeration fan in bin 22 for years. I told them where they could find my emails about it in the company server. I was very polite, very factual, very brief. Patriot Heritage tried to fire Sutton on November 5th. He hired a lawyer the same day. There was apparently some kind of golden parachute clause in his employment contract that his father-in-law had written in. He walked away with 2 years of salary. His wife divorced him about a month later. But that's a different story, and not one I have any business getting into. The Vertica Analytics people pulled HarvestMind out of Cedar Bluff on November 12th. They issued a press release blaming implementation partner errors and incomplete data migration. Their valuation, which had been climbing toward $400 million during their Series B fundraising, dropped to $90 million by Christmas. Patriot Heritage tried to sell Cedar Bluff in December. There were no takers. By February, they were in talks to merge with a competing co-op out of Missouri on terms that I'm told were not favorable. I got a phone call on the second Monday of January. The number was the main office line at Cedar Bluff. I let it ring through to voicemail. It was the new acting general manager, a man named Royce Tilton, who I knew because he used to be the silo supervisor in Promise City. They promoted him as an emergency measure. He left a long message asking if I'd consider coming back. As a consultant, 6-figure contract. Whatever terms I wanted. I called him back the next day not because I was going to take the job, but because Royce was a decent man and I owed him the courtesy. I told him no. He said he understood. He said he'd told the board I'd probably say no. He said he had to ask anyway. I asked him how the farmers were doing. He said about 40 of them had broken their contracts and were delivering to the co-op over in Albia now. He said the Vandermeers were suing. He said the trucker shortage was the worst he'd ever seen because nobody wanted to work for the place anymore. But the Hyde is gonna do. He said he was going to try to keep the lights on until the merger went through, and then he was going to retire. I told him I'd be praying for him. I meant it. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and looked out the window at the bird feeder Marlene had hung from the porch. There was a cardinal on it. I watched it for a while. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. There's a version of this story where the guy who got fired sits back and laughs while his old company burns down. That's not how it felt. Those were my farmers. That was my elevator. The Vandermeers had been good people. Tucker Glasgow, even as much as I'd argued with him about his loads, was a real human being whose family was going to suffer because somebody in Minneapolis decided to save 15% on operational costs. I started a consulting business in February. I help small co-ops in Iowa and Missouri evaluate their technology and their operations. I tell them up front that I don't sell software. I tell them that if their general manager has been at the job for less than 5 years, I won't take their money. I tell them that any system change in agriculture needs at least 2 harvest cycles of parallel operation before you decommission the old way of doing things. About half the co-ops I talk to listen. The other half tell me they appreciate my time, and they go ahead and buy whatever the consultant in the expensive shoes is selling them. I send those ones a Christmas card every year. So far, 2 of them have called me back the following spring. Marlene and I had Cyril over for dinner last Saturday. He's 73 now and slowing down, but he still comes to the diner most mornings. He told me Sutton Whitcomb has resurfaced as a vice president at some agricultural technology startup out in Denver. The company specializes in AI-driven supply chain optimization for the cattle industry. I poured Cyril a glass of bourbon and one for myself. I lifted the glass and said, "Here's to the men and women who actually run the trucks and tend the bins and walk the fields. And here's to the people smart enough to listen to them." Cyril clinked his glass against mine. The cardinal was still on the feeder when I went to bed that night. I watched it for a minute through the kitchen window, then I turned off the light and went upstairs. Some things you can replace. A lot of things, actually. But the ones you can't, you usually don't find out about until after they're gone. I've been turning this whole thing over in my head for almost a year now, and I keep coming back to one simple truth. Everything that fell apart at Cedar Bluff fell apart because somebody chose a shortcut over a foundation. Sutton Whitcomb didn't fail because he was stupid. He failed because he believed that 15 years of hard-won knowledge could be downloaded into a server in 90 days. The cause was arrogance. The effect was a burned silo, a ruined family farm, a baby almost born in the front seat of a pickup truck, and a company that probably won't see its 100th anniversary. When I sat across from Sutton in that creaky leather chair, I had a choice to make. I could have spent the next 4 months sabotaging the transition. I could have deleted my notes, corrupted the data exports, called the farmers and warned them off. Plenty of men in my position would have, and plenty of men would have called it justice. I didn't do any of that, and I want to be clear about why. Not because I'm a saint, I'm not. But because I knew that if I poisoned the well on my way out, every bushel of bad corn that came after would belong to me too. The farmers I'd worked with for 16 years didn't deserve to pay for my revenge. So I kept my word, I kept my mouth shut, and I let the consequences of Sutton's decisions land where they belonged. On him. That's what I mean when I talk about character. Character isn't being kind when things are going well. Character is what you do in the quiet moments when nobody would ever know if you cut a corner. I could have cut 100 corners on my way out the door. I didn't. And when the investigators called me on October 28, I could tell them the truth without flinching because the truth was on my side. The wisdom part of this, if there is any, is something I wish I'd learned 20 years earlier. Loyalty to an institution is not the same thing as loyalty to the people inside it. Cedar Bluff, the company, sold me out the day Patriot Heritage signed the papers. But the Vandermeers, Tucker Glasgow, Cyril, the truckers, and the silo crews, those were the people I owed something to. I confused the two for 16 years. Don't make that mistake. Tie your loyalty to people, not to logos. And the grit part. The reason I'm in business for myself now, working with small co-ops who actually listen, is that I refuse to spend my last years sitting on a porch feeling sorry for myself. Getting fired at 53 is a punch in the gut. It would have been easy to crawl into a recliner and let Marlene worry about the bills. I didn't. I built something smaller, slower, and more honest than what I had before. That's the only kind of starting over that's worth doing. If you take one thing from my story, take this. The people who actually do the work are almost never the ones in the framed photographs. Find them. Listen to them. And whatever you do, Don't be the man who paints his office before he understands what's going on inside the building.